The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. The Pacific Northwest is an area filled with beauty and darkness. Its breathtaking landscapes of clear water, evergreen trees, and mountains with snow-capped peaks unspoiled by the hand of man. Its idyllic visage was the filming locations for movies that defined generations, like The Goonies, the Twilight franchise, the Twin Peaks series, Practical Magic, and a horror fan favorite, The Shining at the Timberline Lodge, just to name a few. It has these incredibly gorgeous days when the sun's rays open the shutters of disillusionment, illuminating everything with this crisp, clean lens, and the pictures of a vibrant future come into focus. But there are times, sometimes more than not, that the gray, wet days can penetrate the plate of exposure on the sunny disposition of many vibrant souls and residents in the area. It's hard not to notice the high rates of suicide and prolific serial killer history in the region. Seattle was known in the 80s for the Space Needle, but was starting to become known for another, less desirable reason. The area just south of the city, on what is dubbed the Pacific Highway Strip, topless clubs, by-the-hour motels, and sex workers were available en masse. And with this access to people vulnerable to abuse, brought the opportunity of prey to the stalking predator. There had been an uptick in women and children that were disappearing, and several had been found murdered and dumped in the Green River. It was on a cold, wet night that 20-year-old Rebecca found herself in November 1982. She had just finished work as a telemarketer near SeaTac Airport and was hitchhiking home in the dark. She would have called a cab, but it would have cost her just as much as she had made that day. Besides, she felt that she was street smart enough to be safe and could take care of herself. A man in a primer-spotted truck slowed down as he pulled up beside her to offer her a ride. Wanting to get out of the cold, wet, miserable weather, she accepted. She had no idea this moment would become the haunting memory that would last a lifetime. While inside the truck, the man propositioned her for a sex act for $20. Having previous experience in sex work, she wasn't unaccustomed to this kind of proposal from a stranger. But she was trying to maintain a straight life and wasn't interested. But the man did not take her no for an answer. He began to coax her and use the old, "but I'm not a bad guy, even though I just propositioned you for sex." The man used his mild demeanor and hardworking everyday guy status, showing her his work ID from the Kenworth factory a short distance away, a picture of his son, and cash. He eased her survival instincts by letting her know he was a local, stable family man that wouldn't hurt her. She relaxed enough to agree. After all, she needed the money. He suggested a spot in the woods that would guarantee privacy, and he drove them to a trailer park to get there. Outside of the truck in the woods, as she was performing, the man was having trouble becoming aroused. Frustrated by his own impotence, the man focused his anger on her. He accused her of biting him. He suddenly pushed her to the ground, and she found that he was trying to get his strong arms around her neck like a police chokehold. Rebecca realized that at that moment he was trying to kill her. In a mad scramble of desperation, she decided that she was not going to die. Visions of a future with marriage and children flashed through her mind as she managed to push him into a tree and escape. She ran as fast as she could through the wet, slick woods and fields, trying to stay on her feet. Her heart pounding, lungs on fire in her chest, pushed herself to move faster until she reached the nearest mobile home and began banging on the door. Screaming for help like claiming sanctuary at the doors of a church, the inhabitants answered her prayers by letting her inside for safety. The assailant never had a chance to catch up with her, with his limp member in his hands and his pants around his ankles. Sorry, that thought just tickles me. Unfortunately, Rebecca would not go to the police to report the terrifying events of the attack that night. She knew the police were representatives of the society that they served, mind and body. With her previous sex work and drug use, Rebecca did not trust the police would believe her that she was the victim of a crime. The possibility that getting into legal trouble and the thought of having to defend herself not only against her attacker but the justice system did not seem something like she could overcome. After all, if she had felt valued by the society around her, she probably would not have felt desperate enough to have to do the things that she did to survive. She had no reason to believe that the authorities would believe her accusations against the upstanding white male member of society. The man's status as a stable family man was a double-edged sword. Just as it had sliced through her defenses, it would take the head off any claim she brought against him, with the justice system preconceived notions of what a predator was. Perhaps if Rebecca had gone to the authorities just after the attack committed against her, police would have been able to connect the crime against her with the murders of the women and children that had been happening in the last 4 months. Women and children whose lives were ended with desperation and strangulation at the hands of a predator. Perhaps if they had heard her story of escaping a man determined to choke the life out of her in the dark, secluded woods, with no one to hear her screams, they would have linked it to the enraged man targeting vulnerable women and children, that they would later call the Green River Killer. But Rebecca had no idea of the dangers she had survived, or the depravity of the future of so many held in the hands of this man. She had no idea that just in the 1.5 years it would take her to build the courage to go to the authorities, that the Green River Killer would kill over 27 women and children. When Rebecca realized that she needed to tell someone, because of her survival, she was able to give the police vital information about the man who attacked her. After all, he showed her his company ID, never thinking that she would make it out of that primer-spotted truck alive to tell a soul. When investigators sat Rebecca down with a book of suspect photos to try to identify her attacker, she was able to identify the man that picked her up that night. The man that had tried to take away the dreams of a better life with a husband and children. The man she recognized as her attacker was Gary Ridgway. Gary Leon Ridgway was born February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the middle child of 3 sons born to parents Tom and Mary. The family later moved to Seattle, Washington. Gary's father, Tom, was a bus driver that worked the Seattle area. As a bus driver, Tom would sometimes take young Gary with him on his route. These occasions would allow Tom the classroom he needed to demonstrate the teachings that he instilled in Gary from a young age. The teachings that sex workers were the scum of the earth and filthy. Tom would berate them, telling Gary that society was better off without their existence. He would say these things right before he would leave Gary on the bus while he went and had sex with them. Tom would also tell Gary stories about working in a mortuary and how a friend would perform necrophilia with corpses. What a confusing as fuck way to see women. This was Gary's first exposure to the concept of having intercourse with someone dead, because he wouldn't get caught and that she wouldn't feel it. Interesting that he's already putting together that sex is a bad thing that he would get caught doing. Also, that she wouldn't feel it, or that if I don't try, I can't fail, at least with someone living. It's also interesting because usually guys are so preoccupied with their performance. I guess he was preoccupied with his performance, therefore he never even tried. Or he would be afraid to try. That's why he thought necrophilia was okay. Anyway, some say that Tom was a weak man who was willing to give up his autonomy and adapt a subordinate role to that of his wife, Mary. She had to take all the responsibility of being an adult, taking care of the household, majority of the child rearing, finances, major decisions, and the family management. But yet Tom would get angry with Gary when he was bullied by a fellow classmate. He encouraged Gary to be violent in his response, and so Gary took down his attacker, feeling the rush of violence and power. Mary was described by neighbors as always done up. She was very attractive with long styled hair, makeup done, clothes nice but revealing. She was also seen as outgoing and popular. Mary was a confident woman that didn't mind attracting attention. Neighbors were quoted as saying that she stood out, apart from the other mothers, wearing clothes that were not this style, especially for a mother, and that she was trying to be glamorous, not like our moms. This is typical of people who believe that the mother should be encompassed by her children and have no interest of her own after giving birth. How many times does society praise mothers for sacrificing themselves rather than living to be healthy role models with their own interests? So ladies, if you have children, God forbid you resemble the fabulous diva you once were. There are various reports of Mary as a person. With Gary, she was said to have spent time with him and tried to help him with his reading. There is a consensus that Mary expected the boys to behave and was the only disciplinarian. Uncontested in her role as authority figure in the family, Mary was physically and emotionally abusive with her husband and her 3 boys. Her daughter-in-law would tell that she had once smashed a plate on Tom's head and he didn't react. It was also believed, even by the prosecutor against Gary Ridgway, that his mother had sexually abused him. According to Gary, his mother had told him that masturbation was worse than rape, so as an early teen, he must have been confused and frustrated. He was also a bedwetter until his early teens, and his mother, although not angry with him, but rather annoyed at this problem, would bathe him after these incidents. Gary later admitted that he had become sexually attracted to her once, when her nudity was exposed by her loosely tied robe, that he had thoughts of having sex with her and killing her, leading to conflicting feelings of sexual attraction, rage, and shame. It's safe to say that this inappropriate touching would have been a paramount reason for his thoughts, along with the abuse he was suffering from his father. But according to one professor that had an opinion on this case, he believed that boys should see their mothers as asexual, and that they should not have to think of their mothers having sex, which is interesting on 2 levels. First, all boys who have a mom who has sex thinks about having sex with her, killing her, and turning into a serial killer. I know men can be violent, but not all are serial killers or think of such things just because they found out their mom has a sex life. And what about throughout history, and still to this day, with families that only have one-room homes? People don't just have one child. Second, perhaps boys would not be having these thoughts of sex with their mother if the society in which they were being raised wasn't over-sexualizing women in the first place, as with the case of Tom's choice of child-rearing for Gary, which I think was equally abusive. There are plenty of societies in which nudity and sex are seen as natural aspects of being a healthy human, and are not hypersexualized and pumped with vulgarity as a mass marketing scheme through the veil of the Madonna and horror complex. I'll explain that in another video. Gary was later described by fellow classmates as quiet, a wallflower that stayed in the shadows, and was withdrawn. He did not have the social skills that his brothers had. He also was slow to learn and had dyslexia. Without the appropriate help, this led to his education suffering, making him feel stupid, inadequate, and angry. Gary started his serial killer path as most do. He began to act out with violence against animals and setting fires in order to deal with his anger. His sexual frustration led to a preoccupation with sex. He was transfixed with getting any action he could. Gary sexually abused his cousin, started peeping in windows, and accidentally brushed up against women's breasts. This, coupled with the fire he had started in a school because he was angry at his failing grades, it became apparent to his parents that he needed help. Gary and Tom actually took Gary to a psychologist. Unfortunately, this was not helpful other than giving Gary the practice he needed to make people believe what they wanted. Gary was starting to realize that if he was convincing enough, he could get away with anything. This was also the time that Gary was becoming fascinated with murder and perfecting how to get away with violent assaults and possibly his first fledgling killings. Gary later admitted that when he was 16, he had lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods. He stabbed the little boy in the kidney, nearly killing him. Side note, in order to stab someone in the kidney, they have to be stabbed in the back. So, not that Gary had any honor in the first place, I just think it's messed up. He was behind this little boy, and he stabbed him in the back. When the boy asked Gary why he stabbed him, Gary simply said he wanted to know what it was like to stab someone. The boy apparently made it home and was able to receive life-saving care, but was unable to tell authorities who assaulted him because he didn't know who Gary was. Gary later claimed it was possible that he had drowned 2 boys in a nearby lake, but wasn't sure because he only had a vivid recollection rather than an actual memory. There were reports of 2 boys drowning in a nearby lake at the time, but no investigation into the drownings was done. I guess they thought they were accidents? He ended up graduating 2 years behind because of his struggles in school. Gary married his high school girlfriend Claudia in 1967 and joined the U.S. Navy. While serving overseas in Vietnam during the war, where he did see combat, Gary frequented sex workers and acquired an STD. This incensed him, but did not stop him from having unprotected sex. Upon returning to the United States, he and his wife divorced in 1972 after it was acknowledged that neither one of them had been faithful. But Gary's own infidelities did not hinder his ability to turn the situation around and fuel his resentment towards women. He called Claudia a whore and berated her. In true fashion for Gary, he was not single or without the company of women for long. He met and married Marcia in 1973. Marcia was a bigger girl, and at the time, he was working at the Kenworth factory as a painter, and he seemed like a stable, regular guy, so she felt fortunate. She would later say that Gary did have a voracious appetite for sex, and, well, according to all women that were involved with him, whether it was wives or girlfriends, they would claim that he was insatiable in this regard. Marcia would claim that Gary liked to have sex multiple times a day and in public places. She didn't mind this because it made her feel desirable and wanted. Marcia also stated that Gary tried a police chokehold on her, but she didn't like that. Marcia also had to deal with Gary's mother, Mary. Gary and Mary. I hate it when parents do that to their children. Gary had allowed Mary to maintain a great deal of his adulting duties. He was a man-child. He relied on her to buy his clothes and make all major financial decisions. He even gave her his paycheck. Marcia and Gary had a son together, and this only added to the tension. Marcia believed that Mary regarded her as an unfit wife and mother. With the birth of their son, the dynamic of the relationship had changed between Marcia and Gary. He was no longer the full focus of Marcia's attention, and she could no longer give Gary everything that he wanted. He turned to religion, and she turned to gastric bypass surgery. Gary became as dementedly devotional to his religious dogma as he had to his prolific procurement of personal pleasure. He began chugging the Kool-Aid of the sins of women, believing that women should be humble and obedient. Y'all, I use that word so infrequently, I actually forgot how to spell it. Things like wearing red, cutting their hair, and working outside the home were against his views. But yet, he didn't want any more children. Odd for the barefoot and pregnant rhetoric. But this was just Gary's way of maintaining control over Marcia, who had decided to have gastric bypass. She started losing weight and feeling confident. This enraged Gary, and he became jealous of any attention Marcia got, especially from men. It's interesting that some men need to find someone they can keep insecure so that they don't feel insecure about being abandoned. Marcia did cheat on Gary. Of course, he had been cheating on her the whole time with sex workers, and they divorced in 1981, leaving Gary to be a weekend dad and have to pay child support. This became another bout of rejection, hurt, and betrayal that Gary deluded himself with in his fury at the foul fiends of the female persuasion. He detested that he had to pay her child support. Because of this, Gary actually thought about killing Marcia and his son, but he didn't think he could get away with it. But being single did not deter Gary from his sexual desires. With his need for sexual satisfaction, he continued to frequent sex workers, fueling his feelings of frustration and hatred towards them. Also, after his divorce from his second wife, he joined a single parents club to meet women. This is a common practice for predators of various kinds. They feel that women that are divorced mothers are easy targets because of the lack of self-esteem. Combined with the fact that he had a child, this made him less of a threat and made the women feel safer. He apparently dated quite a few women, but again, like most predators, he chose women that had troubled pasts or damaged psyches. One relationship was actually quite serious. Her name was Darla. When questioned later, she reported that Gary had an appetite for sex that was voracious, and he was excited by public sex, even at his work. As a couple, they explored his fantasies, particularly while camping, with bondage in the woods. Darla also stated that Gary wanted to insert fruits into her vagina, seemingly not to inflict pain, but for sexual arousal. I thought there was probably a name for this, other than just a fetish, but I wasn't able to find one that would fit doing it to another person rather than someone doing it to themselves. So, if you guys know of a word for it, let me know. I'm curious. Eventually, Gary let her know that he wanted full custody of his son. Darla realized this wasn't what she was looking for in a relationship and ended things with Gary, who seemed genuinely sad about the ending. After the breakup, Darla's daughter described Gary as creepy. The Seattle area in 1982 would quietly become a stalking ground for the predator, far beyond anyone's worst nightmare. But this landscape of blue fields, dense woods, and blue waterways was not a soft focus illusion, but the hard, cold reality for the women and children in the area. The same green fields, dense woods, and blue waterways would be the dark clutches of death where a serial killer would rape, kill, and dump his victims. On July 15th, a lifeless body was found in the Green River, caught under the pilings of Peck Bridge on Meek Street in Kent by two boys. The female was thought to be about 25 years old, 5'4", 140 pounds, Caucasian, and had been strangled with her own clothing. There was no meaningful way to make identification. Her clothes were unremarkable and she had no ID, but she did have several tattoos. The victim was not identified until the release of the description of her tattoos that a local tattoo artist came forward. She was 16-year-old Wendy Cofield. She had been missing for 7 days. Much like the lives of other sex workers and runaways, Wendy was the victim of generational trauma, leaving her with little hope or choices. The patterns of poverty, substance abuse, teen pregnancy, homelessness, lack of education, and abuse caused insecurities that were evident in the history of Wendy and her mother, Virginia. Wendy told Virginia that she had been raped while hitchhiking, and her mother said, "Well, I told you that would happen." So it was no surprise that when she found out that her daughter had been murdered and dumped in the Green River like garbage, she said, "I kind of expected it. I know that's the kind of life she chose for herself. We taught her the best we could." I might also mention that one report says that Wendy was seeing a 21-year-old man that Virginia also started seeing at the same time. He was physically abusive to both of them, and mother and daughter would fight over him. Virginia stated that when Wendy was found, she wanted to get her help for her daughter when she was at a juvenile center for petty crime, but the juvenile center didn't do anything. Before Wendy was released from the juvenile center, the psychologist evaluated her and determined Wendy generally did not look at me and was consistently sullen throughout the examination. At times, she expressed herself angrily. She generally appeared reluctant to extend herself mentally and tended to give up over easily. She evidenced a general dysmorphia and pessimism about herself and her situation. She was an angry, resistant, immature young woman who seemed deeply unhappy with herself and with her external world. All in all, I believe Wendy is certainly not capable of managing her own life constructively and in socially appropriate directions. No shit. This psychologist should be a detective with that level of perception. She's a child who's been abused and is tired and unhappy about it. Shocker. By the way, she's a female child, not a young woman. A young woman implies that she's an adult woman who is young. Not true in this case. Almost exactly 1 month later, another horrifying discovery would be made on the banks of the Green River. The body of 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner was found by a worker at a nearby slaughterhouse. Deborah was a high school dropout turned sex worker, but Deborah was trying to work for a better future. She was working to pay off fines received from previous prostitution convictions, get her GED, and join the Navy. She had an abusive pimp, aka boyfriend, that had encouraged her to work the circuit of prostitution hubs from Portland, Seattle, Spokane, and Yakima. Deborah told friends that she was trying to get away from him and the life just days before her disappearance on July 25th. This information initially made her pimp the most likely suspect. 3 days after the discovery of Deborah, a man scavenging in a raft along the Green River saw the bodies of 2 women that he thought at first were mannequins submerged in the water. When authorities arrived, it was evident that with the reeds along the bank that were 6 feet tall, concealment of the victims was easy. The bodies had been so well hidden out of sight that while trying to get to the location down the bank to the victims, one of the responding detectives, Detective Reichert, almost stepped on a 3rd victim that had been placed along the bank rather than in the water. The scene must have been frantic, chaotic, and alien. One of the victims was Marcia Chapman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 children that she was trying to support on her own, but couldn't make enough with a minimum wage job, which was all she could get. By the way, minimum wage at the time was $2.30 an hour, or $398 a month. The average cost of rent in the area at the same time, it was $368 a month. So yeah, minimum wage wasn't even the minimum to survive. Sex work was a desperate means of survival for her and her children, and she had been known to the detectives responding to the crime scene. The mother's nude body had been weighed down with heavy boulders on her shoulders and hips. The other 2 victims were 16-year-old Opal Mills and 17-year-old Cynthia Hines. Both had gone missing just days before. Upon medical examination, it was found that the victims had been raped, strangled, and the rocks been placed in their vaginas so tightly that they had to be surgically removed. With the bodies of 5 women having been found murdered, the police knew that at least one killer needed to be captured. This was despite the lack of initial media coverage regarding the bodies being found, and the community's lack of compassion for the victims as they were sex workers. The old, they chose this lifestyle, therefore they take the risks, blah, 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 as if it's okay to die for $20. They believed that, with the help of the media only using mugshots for the victims, that the women who worked as sex workers were lazy and preferred to defile themselves rather than get a straight job. They were seen as women who enjoyed sex, were promiscuous, and had no self-respect. King County government was resistant to provide funding for the investigations or its later expansion into the murders because it wouldn't help the county's reputation to use taxpayer money on murdered hookers. When the bodies of more victims continued to be discovered throughout 1983 and 84 in the area, some of the community would protest that these deaths were not getting investigated appropriately because they were sex workers, or that the murderer would soon target good girls. Others in the community would protest that sex workers needed to be eliminated so that the area would be clean. The pressure on the police force was to target sex workers rather than the Johns. Despite this, the best investigators in their fields were called to determine and detain the relentless predator. A profile was starting to form as well. With help of FBI profiler John Douglas, investigators had a profile to assist them. Agent Douglas determined there was one sole killer that felt no remorse for the people he chose because they were sex workers. He believed that they deserved to die and was doing a service to mankind. The killer would not choose them based on race or age, but rather the availability of sex workers and runaways. The motive was not power, recognition, or publicity, and the killer preferred not to be found, unlike some other killers. The killer was a male, Caucasian, his mid-20s to 30s, but might be older because of his organized method. He was single, a loner, and have a history of erratic employment in a field that was labor or maintenance related, that involved strength rather than intellect. He would have a large vehicle, truck or van, to transport the victims, most likely even with a camper to provide privacy. He would have OCD, likely be a drinker and a smoker, and have an average IQ. A history of divorced parents, being raised by a single mother who was domineering and abusive. This relationship would start his fascination with resenting women and despising any power or control they seemed to have. He would feel inadequate with failed relationships with women, leading him to target sex workers because he felt they had more power than they should. The typical bully attitude: I'm going to reassert my masculinity by picking on someone smaller and more vulnerable than me. He would have anxiety, insomnia, and be nocturnal in his pursuits. Trophies from victims would be taken and given to female significant others, mother, girlfriend, wife, which was in contradiction to him being single and having failed relationships, but whatever. One thing authorities thought for certain was that the predator would not stop unless he was detained for perhaps another unrelated crime, or died. By 1984, King County investigators had linked 20 murdered victims to the Green River Killer, with dozens more missing. But by this time, the killer had started dumping his victims in other locations, secluded wooded areas or fields. There were so many crimes, tips, suspects, and victims' lives to investigate that detectives and other officers were overwhelmed. Funding, resources, staff, time, and support were luxuries that were not in great supply. It was difficult to determine which women and children that were missing or found murdered were the work of the Green River Killer or another killer, serial or not. There was an enormous amount of physical evidence that also had to be processed. The detectives were even in contact with Ted Bundy, who was incarcerated in Florida at the time for his own serial murders. They were hoping that Bundy would be able to provide insight into the mind of the Green River Killer for a psychological profile. Bundy's motives were not out of the care of murdered women and children, families, or future victims, but for his own selfish gains, which were his ego, notoriety, and to delay his own death sentence. He did tell the investigators that the perpetrator would likely return to the dump site to practice necrophilia with the victims, because that's what he would have done. Among the tips and suspects, one man kept coming under the view of investigators: Gary Ridgway. With all the media coverage of the multitude of victims, Rebecca had decided that she needed to go to the police about her experience with the man in the woods that tried to kill her. Because he had showed her his work ID to make her feel more comfortable, police went to Kenworth to question Gary about the incident. Shockingly, the appearance of detectives to question one of their workers about the potential link to a serial murder investigation did not seem to concern the Kenworth company. In fact, Gary had already had a reputation at the factory of being creepy and exhibiting inappropriate behavior towards female coworkers. There were complaints of unwanted touching and even an admission by Gary that the Green River Killer was doing the city a favor. The questioning and the polygraph that he passed only emboldened Gary, and he started bragging that he was a suspect. At the facility, he would become known as Green River Gary. Did anyone think this was funny? Gary claimed that the incident with Rebecca was self-defense of sorts, because she bit him while performing. But this was not the first time Gary had been questioned by officers. April of the year prior, in 1983, a young man named Richie came forward to police that his girlfriend had been abducted. There was a delay and lies in his story because he didn't actually want to tell police and get in trouble that he was pimping his girlfriend. Richie saw the abduction of his 18-year-old girlfriend, Marie Malvar. Marie had gotten into a truck with primer spots. According to Richie, he noticed something off right away. Marie had seemed agitated and scared once they were driving. Fearing for her safety, he followed the truck in a desperate attempt to get Marie out, but lost them in the dark and unfamiliar streets of South Seattle area. He finally went to police 4 days later, but the detectives felt that Marie left on her own and did not pursue the matter. Frustrated, Richie went to Marie's father and with her brother. The three drove the streets of the area looking for the truck that Richie saw Marie get into. They found it, parked in front of a home in a cul-de-sac that Richie had missed the night of Marie's abduction. The men notified police, who went to the residence. The officer questioned the man in the home, and with the statement that "I'm the only one here," the officer was satisfied and did not press the man any further. He didn't feel the killer would be brazen enough to take such a high risk as killing someone so close to his home, or even in his home. The man was Gary Ridgway. By the beginning of 1985, there were over 40 women and children that had been found murdered attributed to the Green River Killer. And Gary was starting to date the woman he finally found that would make his life more complete, and the murders suddenly trickled. Judith was a 40-year-old divorcee with a difficult past when she met 36-year-old Gary. She'd fallen in love with his loving, gentle, and kind demeanor. He was a gentlemanly, calm, and masculine man that never seemed to get angry, and he took his time making her feel safe. Judith would move into Gary's house that didn't have any carpet because he spilt paint on it or previous tenants ruined it. They enjoyed country line dancing, camping, fishing, and did everything together. Judith was the take-charge sort with her interior design and financial matters. According to her, Gary's life needed a woman's touch, and she made her mark. They married after 3 years and remained happily so, despite his several arrests for solicitation, which he said he was innocent. Judith was standing by her man, even when one of those arrests in 1987 was a result of Gary soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a sex worker. The arrest gave authorities enough probable cause to obtain a search warrant for Gary and Judith's home and a DNA sample from Gary. However, no evidence was found of any crime, and the technology for DNA testing was years away from becoming a viable source of solving crimes. With fewer victims being found by 1986, the task force had been downsized and all but defunct. By 1981, King County had spent $15 million on the investigation, had processed 9,000 pieces of evidence, followed up on 90,000 tips, and investigated hundreds of suspects, but the trail seemed to be going cold. The task force even entertained the help of a psychic for the locations of the victims and the identity of the killer. By the time Detective Kirk was elected sheriff of King County for his second term in 2001, the case of the Green River Killer was almost 20 years old. Reichert was determined that there would be a conclusion to these killings. He had been on the task force, diligently working and sacrificing his personal life and family, along with all the other task force members, to hunt the identity of the merciless killer. He prioritized renewing, funding, and manning the Green River Task Force, and with new DNA technology, he hoped that the suspect's identity would be hidden within the evidence gathered all those years ago. It was also common knowledge in the investigation that Gary Ridgway was the prime suspect, with his many interactions with authorities and computer hits. So Reichert was not surprised when the results of the DNA testing that he had ordered from some of the evidence from the Green River victims came back as a match to Gary Ridgway. Other evidence found on the victims was processed as well. Among the various fibers, dog hairs, and foreign hairs that were not the victims, there was paint evidence that was analyzed. In this analysis, it was determined that the paint that was found on several of the victims could only have come from the Kenworth manufacturing plant, where Ridgway was known for his gruesome moniker. Remember they called him Green River Gary? The task force finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. Being linked through physical evidence and DNA for 4 Green River murder victims, Gary Ridgway was arrested and charged in the fall of 2001. He claimed he was innocent and that the authorities had the wrong man. He pleaded not guilty. Through more DNA testing, Ridgway was charged with another 3 murders that he pleaded not guilty to as well. The King County prosecutor felt that there was a decision that had to be made. It was thought that with the strong physical evidence that the conviction of the 7 murders Gary Ridgway was charged with was likely, and because of the heinousness of the crimes, a death penalty could result. However, without strong DNA evidence for the other 41 deaths, it was unlikely that Ridgway would confess and be willing to give up any details about those victims and their whereabouts. Prosecutor, knowing that Ridgway deserved the death penalty, would have to consider whether to offer Ridgway a plea deal for confessions and information regarding the still open cases of the Green River Killer in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. Ridgway's defense attorney talked at length to his client regarding the strong evidence against him and the repercussions of the trial on Ridgway's own family. His 2 brothers and sister-in-law visited him while he was in jail and proved to be a turning point for Ridgway and the expediency of getting answers to long-held questions. Through some months and long conversations between his defense attorney, Ridgway, and the King County prosecutor, a plea deal was agreed to. The plea deal would take the death penalty off the table in exchange for Ridgway to plead guilty to any and all future cases and crimes committed in King County. He would provide confessions, information, and the whereabouts of all his crimes and victims in King County, and that the agreement would be rescinded if he was found to have not confessed to all of his crimes in that county. Ridgway confessed and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder in the first degree for 48 women and children and was sentenced to life for each. However, his plea agreement is only valid for King County. If investigators in other counties or states find that he is responsible for the murders in their jurisdiction, they may file charges against him and seek the death penalty. But without any solid evidence, it's unlikely that he'll confess to any murders outside King County. During Ridgway's confessions, he admitted to sexually assaulting and murdering at least 71 victims. Some investigators think it could be as many as 90. He chose victims that were less experienced sex workers or runaway children. Ridgway would make his victims more comfortable after taking them to his house by showing them his son's room before killing them. In similar fashion to his father, like son, Ridgway admitted to picking up a sex worker and killing her in the woods while his 7-year-old son was in the car. Ridgway also committed necrophilia with one of his victims at a dump site while his son was in the car 30 feet away. He admitted to trying to throw investigators off by writing letters to newspaper outlets and authorities, removing some of the bodies or parts of bodies to relocate them to other areas or even other states, pouring acid on scratch marks that victims had left on him, and removing the carpet in his home to get rid of forensic evidence. As per the plea deal, he took the detectives to the sites where he dumped his victims' bodies, as many as he could remember. Some victims were recovered, but not all, and some that were remain unidentified. There were so many victims that Ridgway could not remember the details for all his crimes, and when questioned by investigators, he maintained that he could only remember what he could and there was nothing he could do about it. Generally, he did not remember the names of his victims, but rather the situation in which he had killed them and where he had left their bodies. Ridgway confessed that, like Bundy had posited, he would return to the dump sites to commit necrophilia with the bodies because either he could no longer have sex with the living or he didn't have to find another victim. He stated both, so it's unsure which. He brushed aside flies and maggots and engaged repeatedly until decomposition eliminated the possibility. He started disposing of his victims farther and farther out of his reach and burying some of them so he could resist the temptation because he himself was disgusted by his post-mortem fantasies. He stated his motivation for his crimes was his hatred for women and sex workers in particular and his unwillingness to pay for sex. He likely felt that he was entitled to sex and paying for it would confirm that he was undesirable and disgusting, even from those that he viewed as the lowest dregs of society. But for whatever reason, during his 16-year marriage to Judith, his killing spree had slowed to about 4 victims during this time. Currently, Ridgway is housed at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. Even as recently as 2024, he has been leading investigators to locations of his victims. In hindsight, it was determined that Gary Ridgway was on police radar quite early, but many mistakes made the investigation lead to dozens more deaths. One mistake: one victim had her assailant's hair in her hand at the time her body was recovered, but the evidence was lost and never tested. Another mistake: one of the women that survived an attack by the man believed to be the serial killer had given authorities the attacker's license plate, but the information was not pursued and the number was lost. Third mistake: there were fibers, dog hairs, and paint spheres discovered in 1982 on early victims that had not been analyzed when those victims were found. The paint spheres were finally tested, which led directly to the Kenworth factory who employed Mr. Green River Gary. Lastly, there was the DNA evidence that was not tested until 2001, which ultimately led directly to Ridgway. Oh, and I almost forgot. The polygraph test that he passed, it was later determined that he had actually failed that, but the tech read it wrong. On another note, have you ever had those moments where you think, oh my gosh, that person's almost there? Like they're so close to the real point? In my research, I found it interesting that one writer in the Seattle Times actually mentions the roots of behavior that create men like Gary Ridgway. He writes the roots are deep-seated in the pathologies of society, misogyny among them, and acknowledges how pervasive the problem is and that combating it will take time and dedication. I'm totally with him there. But then he totally misses the mark. He states that... Hold on, I've got the quote. Okay, here it is. He states that as long as there are women and girls desperate enough for money to take a trick, we will not be rid of this problem. Meaning sex work, as if there's only one person participating in the act. No accountability or culpability for men. And then he adds a what can we do section to prevent situations like the Green River Nightmare. However, his suggestions went from possible solutions to illegal fast. He suggested frequent audits for police missing person cases. Good, yes, totally with you. Then, intensive inpatient sex-separated months-long diversion programs for those arrested for prostitution, particularly those who aren't old enough to vote. Now first, he said arrested, not convicted. I know this article was published almost 20 years ago, but I'm pretty sure the Constitution of the United States, with its requirement of due process, was around before that. Oh, and thank you for recognizing that some of these individuals are too young to vote, my guy. But that also means they're children. Children that, to survive, are desperate enough to sell their innocence to sleazy men willing to take it. A choice that legally, just like voting, they do not have the capacity or maturity to make. And worse, the men who prey on them. The men who seek them out and think this behavior is okay and get away with it. We should be judged as a society on how well our vulnerable population, especially our children, are taken care of. Oh, and it gets better. He continues, because this guy is a man, he goes on to suggest that it be required those arrested for prostitution and victims of domestic violence provide DNA samples. Young women arrested ought to be required to have dental records with explanation someday we might need these pictures to identify your bones. It sounds like he's ready to size certain women and children up for their red cloaks and white bonnets. What a waste of breath. Not to mention time, energy, and resources. Perhaps we should consider discussions about the millions of dollars spent to investigate these cases, the known and unknown number of victims whose lives are lost on a daily basis, the time lost with families, the sacrifices of those working these cases, and society's responsibility. Perhaps we should consider discussions about taking down the pervasive toxic masculinity that enables fragile egos in society and allows self-righteous privilege to prevail. An environment that thinks being questioned and suspected of the deaths of over 40 people would earn only a moniker at work rather than an evidential link to a prison sentence. How about turning the anger and energy into works against real problems like sex trafficking within the foster system or equal equality for women, i.e. equal pay, educational and career opportunities, and a supportive community outlets so that women know their worth and have the confidence to be treated the way they want to be treated. Successful programs to break the cycle of generational trauma for systematically, economically disadvantaged groups. Investing in programs that support vulnerable populations rather than setting them up for failure and then punishing them when they do fail. I am in no way suggesting that men like Gary Ridgway are not responsible, but I am suggesting that they are not aberrant or anomalies. I believe society creates these men, and the reason that we don't have more serial killers is because they get caught sooner. But that's just my opinion. So what are the Roman wisdom highlights for today? Well, again, wouldn't it be lovely to live in a society where it wasn't necessary to protect women and vulnerable groups? Where people could rely on the men in their society not to be predators? Stranger danger did not have to exist because a stranger would only offer genuine support as a member of the village? But instead, here we go. Number 1, grown men don't need help from women. Grown men don't need help from children. Period. No more explanation needed on that one. Number 2, communicate. The great thing about cell phones is that you have so much access at your fingertips at any given moment of the day. Send a message or take a photo of something you think is sus to keep yourself safe. Let someone know where you are, where you're going to be, and when you'll be back. Number 3, be confident, be outrageous, be audacious. Predators prey on those who seem weak. Looking down, slouching, looking around like you don't know where you're going, they're all prey mannerisms. If confidence is hard for you, fake it. Use any opportunity to be the badass bitch you need to be to survive. So, thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions or ideas of what you'd like to hear, please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to support the channel, like and subscribe. And as always, be safe. Sending you silver streaks of wisdom. Oh, now Pete comes. You good boy. That was actually good. You left me alone. You want to say hi to the camera? You say hi? I'm a good side. You ready for your close-up? Oh, what a good boy.